The moment my son looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, I need you to stay home," I felt something shift inside me. Not break, not yet, just shift. Like a floorboard you've walked over 1,000 times suddenly making a sound you've never heard before. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a dramatic man. I spent 34 years building a commercial HVAC company from a truck, a toolbox, and a prayer. I got up at 5 every morning. I came home smelling like metal and sweat. I missed school plays. I missed birthdays. Not because I didn't care, because I was trying to build something that would last longer than me. Something my son could have. His name is Brandon. He is 31 years old, and I love him in the way that only fathers who've watched a boy become a man can understand. Quietly, completely, and sometimes painfully. This story is about the night I showed up at his grand opening anyway. Brandon started talking about opening a restaurant 3 years ago. Not just any restaurant, a high-end steakhouse in downtown Austin. He had the concept sketched out on napkins, had the name picked out, had the whole thing mapped in his head. He just didn't have the capital. I did. We sat at my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon in October. His mother had passed 4 years earlier, so it was just the two of us, coffee going cold between us. He laid it all out. The location he'd found on South Congress. The chef he wanted to bring in from Chicago. The design firm he had in mind. The numbers. $840,000 to get it off the ground. I didn't flinch. I told him I'd put up $600,000 and help him secure a loan for the rest. I told him I believed in him. I told him his mother would have been proud of the man sitting across from me. What I didn't tell him was that $600,000 was most of what I had left after selling the company. I'd kept a comfortable cushion for retirement. This would eat into it significantly. But he was my son, and a man invests in what he loves. We shook hands at that table. We hugged. He cried a little, and so did I, though I'd never admit that to anyone who wasn't in that kitchen. Over the next 18 months, I was involved in everything. I helped negotiate the lease. I attended the design meetings. When the contractor they hired tried to pad the invoice by $40,000, I caught it. 30 years in the trades, I know exactly what things cost. I sat with the city inspector when the initial fire suppression permit got flagged. I made phone calls that Brandon didn't even know I was making. I wasn't trying to take over. I was just being his father. His girlfriend Meredith was around for most of this. She'd been with him for about 2 years when all of this started. She worked in commercial real estate, dressed like someone who'd never been to a place that had paper napkins, and had a way of looking at me like I was a contractor who'd shown up to the wrong address. She was pleasant enough on the surface, but something always felt slightly off, like a door that was hung a quarter-inch too high. It closed, technically, but you could always feel the resistance. I mentioned this to Brandon once gently. He told me I was imagining things, that Meredith was just private. I let it go. By spring of this year, the restaurant was nearly finished. The tile was in. The kitchen equipment had been delivered. The signage was going up. Brandon had scheduled the soft opening for the first Friday of June and the official grand opening, the one with press, investors, and the city councilman who represented that district, for the following Saturday night. I asked him what time I should arrive. He got quiet in a way that was different from his normal quiet. "Dad," he said about that. He told me that Meredith had concerns, that the investors coming to the grand opening were a specific kind of people and that the event needed to project a certain image. He used words like curated and cohesive. He told me that Meredith felt my presence might, and he paused here for a long time, create an uncomfortable dynamic, given that I was the primary backer and some of the investors didn't know that. I asked him to say that again. He said it again. I sat with that for a moment. My son was telling me that the woman he was dating had decided I should not attend the opening of the restaurant I funded, because my being there might make people uncomfortable. I asked him if he agreed with her. He said, "I think she might have a point, Dad. Just this one night. I'll have you in for dinner the following week, just us. I'll give you the full tour." I said okay. I told him I understood. I told him to have a good night. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for probably 20 minutes. Then I went inside and I called my attorney. A man named Charles Whitfield who has handled my business affairs for 15 years. I didn't tell him what had happened. I just asked him to pull up the loan agreement and investment documents we'd drawn up for the restaurant. I asked him to remind me of a few specific clauses. He read them back to me. I thanked him and hung up. I slept on it. That's what my father always told me. Sleep on the thing that makes you want to react, because sleep has a way of either clarifying your conviction or dissolving it. I woke up the next morning, made coffee, sat on my back porch, and watched the sun come up over the hill behind my house. My conviction had not dissolved. I got dressed in a blazer and slacks. Not overdressed, not underdressed, just a 63-year-old man who knows how to present himself. I drove downtown. I arrived at the restaurant at 7:15, 45 minutes after the grand opening had started. There was a woman at the door with a clipboard. I told her my name. She scanned the list and told me I wasn't on it. I told her I was aware of that. I told her I was the primary investor in the building she was standing in, and I'd appreciate being let inside. She asked me to hold on and went to find someone. That someone turned out to be Meredith. Meredith came to the door in a black dress, hair up, expression carefully neutral in the way that people practice in mirrors. She told me, quietly but firmly, that this wasn't a good time, that Brandon had explained the situation, that she hoped I could respect what they were trying to accomplish here. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Meredith, I respect you, but I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm here because I have a legal right to be, and because this is my son's night." She said, "If you come inside, it will become about you, and this night cannot be about you." I said, "Then I suppose we'll see." I walked inside. The restaurant was beautiful. I'll give them that. The warm amber lighting, the exposed brick, the leather booths, the long marble bar along the north wall. It was everything Brandon had drawn on those napkins, rendered in full and polished to a shine. About 60 people moved through the space. A jazz trio played near the back. A waitstaff in crisp white shirts moved with practiced ease between tables. Brandon saw me from across the room. His face did something complicated. He excused himself from the group he was standing with and walked toward me. "Dad," his voice was low, "I asked you not to come." "I know you did. This is going to create a problem." "Brandon, I put $600,000 into this room. I watched the tile go in. I caught the contractor fraud. I spent 18 months helping you build this. I'm not asking to give a speech. I'm asking to stand in it for one night." He looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it. Then Meredith appeared at his side. She put her hand on his arm in the particular way that isn't affection, it's direction. "Brandon," she said, "the Hargrove Group is asking for you." He looked at her, then at me, then back at her. He said, "Give me a minute." She didn't move. He said it again, slightly firmer. "Give me a minute, please." She left. We stood there in the amber light of the room I'd helped build, my son and I, and he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have stood up for you. I should have told her from the beginning that you'd be here." I said, "Why didn't you?" He took a breath. "Because it's easier not to, and that's not an excuse. That's just the truth, and I'm ashamed of it." I nodded. I told him I appreciated him saying that. Then I told him there was something else he needed to know. I asked him if he'd sat down recently with the full investment agreement. He said he'd reviewed it when they signed it, but hadn't gone back to it recently. I told him he should. I told him specifically to look at Section 4, subsection C, which outlined the conditions under which the primary investor retained override authority on operating decisions during the first 3 years of business, a standard clause that Charles had insisted on, and that Brandon's attorney at the time had approved without flagging it. Brandon didn't know what to say. I told him I wasn't raising this as a threat. I told him I was raising it because I needed him to understand that there was a structure beneath this beautiful room, and that structure had my name on it, in a way that couldn't simply be set aside because a guest list was being curated. I also told him something I hadn't told anyone yet. 2 weeks earlier, I'd had a conversation with Meredith that he didn't know about. She had called me, not Brandon, me, and suggested that given my age and the amount I'd invested, it might make sense to formalize my role differently. She had used phrases like silent partner going forward and stepping back from the day-to-day. She had mentioned, delicately, that some investors respond poorly when they perceive a founding team as having too many dependencies on outside family relationships. In other words, she had called me alone to begin the process of pushing me out. Before the restaurant had even opened, Brandon's face changed. I watched it happen. The color didn't drain exactly, but something went very still in him. The way still water looks right before it moves. He said, "She called you." I said yes. He said, "And told you to step back." I said that was the gist of it. He stood there for a long moment. Across the room, Meredith was laughing at something the Hargrove Group's representative had said, head tilted, entirely at ease, entirely in her element. Brandon said, "I didn't know about that call." I said, "I know you didn't." She was acting on her own. It appears so. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I didn't want to ruin his night. I meant it. Whatever was between him and Meredith, whatever he needed to work out, that was for another day. Tonight was the opening. Tonight mattered for the restaurant, and the restaurant was real, regardless of everything else. I said, "Introduce me to the Hargrove Group." He looked at me. I said, "Introduce me as your father and as the primary investor. That's who I am. Let's stop pretending otherwise." For a moment, he looked exactly like he did at 7 years old when he broke in the garage window with a baseball and had to come tell me. That mix of dread and relief that comes from deciding to stop hiding something. Then he straightened up. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Okay, Dad, come on." He walked me across the room. Meredith saw us coming. Her expression stayed composed, but her eyes tracked us the way a person tracks something they can't quite categorize as safe or unsafe. Brandon said, "I'd like to introduce you all to my father. He's the one who made this possible." I shook hands. I made conversation. I complimented the chef on the menu because I meant it. I spoke briefly with the city councilman who it turned out had known my HVAC company by reputation. We'd done work on 2 city buildings years ago, and he remembered it. Small world. Meredith stood slightly apart from all of this, not close enough to intervene, not far enough to be absent. At one point, she came to stand next to me very quietly and said, "I hope you understand I was only trying to protect what Brandon built." I said, "I understand that's how you see it." She waited for more. I didn't give her more. Later, after the investors had gone and the jazz trio was packing up and the staff was resetting tables, Brandon and I sat at the bar. He poured us each 2 fingers of bourbon, his own label on it, a small batch thing he'd had made for the restaurant. He said, "I have to figure out some things." I said, "You do." He said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for the list, for not pushing back, for letting her call you without telling me." I said, "I know you are." He turned the glass in his hands. Then he said, "Was the override clause, were you actually going to use it?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "No, I was never going to use it. I just needed you to know it was there. I needed you to understand that there is a foundation beneath this place, and that foundation is not just concrete and rebar, it's the trust between us. And that trust goes in both directions." He nodded slowly. I told him the thing I'd been trying to figure out how to say for a long time. I told him that providing for your children isn't the same as being disposable to them, that a father's sacrifice doesn't come with a guarantee of gratitude, but it does come with an expectation of basic dignity, that I had never once asked him to make me the center of anything. I had only ever asked to be allowed to be present for the things that mattered. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "You're right, and I'm going to do better." I believed him. Not because sons never disappoint. Mine has, I'm sure I've disappointed mine. But because I heard something in his voice that I recognized. The same thing I'd heard at that kitchen table 3 years ago, when he told me his dream. Conviction, real conviction, the kind that doesn't need to perform itself. We finished the bourbon. I helped him carry some things to his car, the way fathers do. I drove home on the highway with the windows down because it was a warm night in Austin. And I'm not too old to appreciate that. I don't know what will happen with Meredith. That's between them. What I know is that my son looked across a room full of investors and introduced me as the man who made it possible. And at 63 years old, after 34 years of early mornings and missed birthdays, after $600,000 and 18 months of phone calls and permit offices and contractor invoices, that was enough. That was exactly enough. I keep coming back to the moment Brandon said he was sorry. Not the polished, practiced kind of sorry that people say when they've been caught, but the real kind. The kind that comes out quiet and a little unsteady. That's the moment I knew we were going to be okay. Not because the apology fixed anything, but because he chose honesty when he didn't have to. That choice mattered more to me than the restaurant, more than the $600,000, more than any of it. What I've learned at 63 is that how a person behaves when things are going well tells you almost nothing about them. The real telling happens under pressure, when there's money involved, when someone they care about is pulling them in a direction that feels easier than the right one. Brandon had let Meredith lead him somewhere he knew was wrong, and he'd gone along because conflict is uncomfortable and love makes people want to keep the peace. I understand that. I've done it myself. But there's a cost to looking the other way when something isn't right, and eventually that cost comes due. Meredith calling me behind his back wasn't just a breach of trust between her and Brandon. It was the kind of maneuver that only works if I don't tell him. She was counting on me to absorb it quietly, and I think she believed I would because fathers often do. We swallow the hard things to protect our children from discomfort. I've done that more times than I can count. But there's a difference between protecting your child and allowing yourself to be made invisible inside a story you helped write. I wasn't going to do that. Not that night. What I want people to understand, and maybe this is the thing I wish someone had said to me when I was Brandon's age, is that doing the right thing requires all three of something. It requires a moral compass, which tells you what's right. It requires the good sense to see clearly when someone is working against that compass, even someone you love, and it requires the backbone to act on what you know, even when acting is costly and uncomfortable and might blow up a room full of investors. Brandon had the compass, he always has. What almost failed him was the second part, the clarity to see what Meredith was doing before it went too far. That's not a character flaw, that's inexperience, and inexperience is curable. What I watched him do across that room, walking me into that crowd and saying my name out loud. That was him finding the third thing in real time. I didn't pull the override clause. I never intended to. But I needed him to know the foundation existed because sometimes the most important thing a father can give his son isn't money or opportunity or even advice. It's the reminder that there are structures beneath the visible world and that those structures were built by someone who loves him and isn't going anywhere. I drove home that night with the windows down. Austin in early June, warm and a little humid, the highway almost empty. I thought about my wife, the way I always do when something big happens. She would have had something short and accurate to say about all of it. She usually did. I think she would have said, "He came through." And she would have been right.